So today is April 10th, 2020. I'm interviewing Ann Sung through Zoom for the Houston Asian American Archive. So we'll start with the interview with the question, where and when were you born?
I was born in Midland, Michigan. That's a little town where my parents worked for Dow Chemical. So I was born in Midland, Michigan, December 11th, 1978.
And how would you describe the household you grew up in?
My parents are immigrants to the US. My dad is an engineer. My mom was a computer scientist. They were both working for Dow Chemical when I was born. And then we moved to Houston very shortly thereafter. So it's a solidly middle-class family. After my younger brother was born, my mom stayed home to raise me. So it was kind of a typical upbringing in Houston.
Okay, and so in Houston, which neighborhood did you guys move to?
We lived in the West Chase area.
And what were some of the values that your parents emphasized in like upbringing you and your brother?
My parents emphasized hard work, responsibility, honesty, and doing your best to make the most of the opportunities that we have in the U.S.
And since your parents were both like in the STEM field, did they ever like encourage you to go that route?
Absolutely, yes. Not not in the sense of saying I had to study math or science, but just my parents, both of them, always encouraged me to explore math and science, to just enjoy them. So I grew up as a kid, going to museums, putting together, taking apart STEM toys, um, playing number games with my mom and my dad. So I just grew up thinking that math and science were fun.
And then what kind of subjects interest you in school, like middle school and high school?
Oh, I loved everything. um, I loved I loved math and science, of course, although it took me a while to like physics. It didn't really click for me until I had enough math. So I loved it in high school. Was kind of confused by it in middle school. And loved biology. Um, and I really, at that age, middle school and high school, really enjoyed English as well. Really enjoyed reading books, literature, writing. Um, so I think I enjoyed all of my academic subjects.
And what high school did you go to?
I went to Bellaire High School.
Okay, cool. And then did you have any influential teachers or mentors in school growing up?
Yeah, so many. I had so many fabulous teachers, all the way through my education. Ms. Raffay was an elementary math teacher who just made math fun, played a lot of games with us in elementary school. In middle school, Ms. Duhan, my 7th grade English teacher, and Mr. Mack, my 8th grade English teacher, they made writers out of us. They really encouraged us to just explore that world and make it our own. And then in middle school and high school, I had amazing math and science teachers. And now that I look back on it, it's really amazing the way they dedicated their time, not just in class, but out of school too. Dr. Beam was my high school physics teacher who also coached our Mu Alpha Theta club, our math club. And he would spend pretty much every weekend with us, right? Every Saturday, we would be out there at a math tournament somewhere. My biology teacher, Ms. Medlin, same, right? Like, she was an amazing biology teacher. I think most of us knew more biology after freshman year at Bellaire High School than most college students know after their first year of college biology. And she coached our academic decathlon team. So, I was really blessed to have teachers who just encouraged us to find the fun in learning.
And so I know mentioned Mu Alpha Theta. What other organizations were you, I guess, involved in outside of academics and outside of school?
I was a swimmer, so I was on my high school swim team uh, for many years. I was also a pianist for the choir. Um, what else? I mentioned academic decathlon, which is kind of a quiz bowl style club. I think those were the big ones. I think I dabbled in a bunch of clubs, but those are the ones that took up most of my time.
And then, like, while in high school, did you have like any idea of like what you wanted to pursue in college, or like even like a career path that you wanted to go along?
I thought I'd probably end up studying math or physics when I was in high school. I think when I was a little bit younger than that, I thought I wanted to be an astronaut, like many kids do. Um, when I got older and understood some of the physical rigors of that, I think I backed off with that a little bit.
So then can you go on to like going on to college? Can you describe like your application process? I guess were you thinking, oh, I want to like leave Houston or like stuff like that?
Oh, I had the opportunity in high school to travel with various math teams, and I was on the U.S. Physics Olympiad team. So I had a chance to see places outside of Houston, and I couldn't wait to go to college and spend more time seeing different parts of the country. So I did apply to schools outside of Houston. Rice was my backup school, um, and um, and then I just applied to a mix of Ivy League schools um, that were in cities that I thought would be cool places to live. So a couple of schools in California, Caltech, Stanford, some East Coast schools, Harvard, Princeton, MIT, um, oh, Duke. So 7 schools.
And then you mentioned that you were on the U.S. Physics Olympiad team.
Yes,
What was
not the
that like
traveling team,
on
but
the
yes, I
traveling team?
did. Yeah, not the traveling team, but my senior year, I did go to the U.S. Physics Olympiad camp, and
Hmm.
yeah,
Okay, what was that like?
that was fun. It was a chance to, be with students from all over the country who were enthusiastic about physics and math. You have to enjoy math in order to be good at physics. Um, and I think there's a lot more infrastructure around mathletics, if you will, in the US than there is around physics. So it was just a neat chance to see how you can take what you would learn in school and then apply it in creative situations.
And then what university did you attend eventually?
I ended up going to Harvard. They gave me
And
the best financial aid package.
okay, awesome. So what was, I guess, your mindset going into Harvard as a freshman, like feelings that you had and like being away from home?
Yeah, I was incredibly excited to to be on my own for the first time, um, to have a chance to be with classmates who were my intellectual peers, right, who would challenge me really. And I found the classes at Harvard just incredible. Like I wanted to just drink it all in, right? Like if I could, my mom used to say that, Anne, you can't be a professional student, right? But I think if I could, I would. I just loved all of my classes and all of the opportunities to learn in so many academic areas.
Okay, awesome. And then what was the year that you started at Harvard?
96.
96. Okay. And so then you graduated in 2000?
Class of 2000.
Okay, awesome. And then, so you mentioned kind of like the academic culture and that was very enriching. And there are a lot of interesting classes. Can you describe like the student culture that you had?
I don't know if I had if I participate in the typical Harvard student culture, right? Like I read in the papers about finals clubs and stuff, and I was like, I didn't participate in any of that. I think that's what Harvard called oh, what are they called? Like we didn't have sororities and fraternities. We had like finals clubs, but I never stepped into one when I was in college. So I think I missed all of that. You know, I ran around with the math and science nerds. And gosh, what about the student culture? You know, students at Harvard are incredibly active, right? Always, you know, creating new extracurriculars. So one of the neat things I had the chance to do when I was at Harvard was a few of my good friends and I had participated in the Rice University math tournament each year. So when we got to Harvard, we said, well, where's the Harvard math tournament? And there wasn't one. And our friend group had gone to a mix of schools there. We had a few people at Harvard, a few people at MIT. So we all got together and said, well, let's have a Harvard MIT math tournament. And so, you know, that was something we did, gosh, was it our freshman year when it was, I think we, we just decided we'd do that, you know, our freshman year, or maybe it was our sophomore year. And then, you know, there's so many service organizations at Harvard. The Phillips Brooke House was kind of a clearinghouse for Harvard students who wanted to create service organizations. So, you know, I would go to Chinatown and teach piano in Boston. And then I became poorer than I expected when I was in college. So so halfway through college, my father broke it to me that he had enough money to support my junior year of college, but not my senior year. So I had to decide between graduating early, which is possible because I had enough AP credits from high school, or, you know, finding some way to pay for it myself. Harvard was great. Their financial aid isn't as good as it is now, but it was in that transition period when Harvard was looking to expand financial aid for middle class and lower class families. So they, I went to the financial aid office. They, you know, we kind of split it 50-50, right? So they put some more money in towards my education and I had to find some more money. So I moved into a cooperative house where a number of Harvard students from similar backgrounds would live, and we would, you know, do our own cooking and cleaning, which cut the housing bill greatly. So so that was interesting. It was kind of like a hippie. It was called the Dudley Co-op. It was this kind of hipster hippie place, so I lived there for my final 2 years at Harvard University, which put me in contact with a lot of people I think I wouldn't have met otherwise, right? People who were, you know, traveling to Mexico to do documentaries about the Zapatistas, you know, people who just, you know, were, you know, big thought leaders, not just for Harvard, but for the country, right? And who were, you know, just living it, you know, the alternative life at the Dudley Co-op. So it was a fun experience.
Okay, awesome. And so before that, you were living on campus, like in one of the dorms?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes. Yeah, let's see. I managed to live kind of as far as I could from campus every year. So freshman year, you know, there's most students lived in that famed Harvard yard, which is where you tourists go if you go to see Harvard. I was, you know, housed, you know, some, you know, block away. And then after that, people get put in the Harvard houses, which are along that beautiful river, right, in Cambridge, that divides Cambridge and Boston. But, you know, I was in the Fortheimer dorm, which was the old Radcliffe dorms for women when Harvard and Radcliffe were separate universities. And then after that, I just left for the co-op. So, but yeah, I was on Harvard campus for the first couple of years.
Okay, awesome. And then going back, like how many of your friends were a part of like founding, I guess, the Harvard MIT math tournament?
Oh, I can think of 4 close friends from Houston who all went to Harvard and MIT together. Edward Early, Alex Saltman, Sean, I'm blanking on his last name. And then there were just a bunch of friends who were in, we were in the same, multivariable calculus class freshman year. So there was another larger group of, 5 to 10 people that helped as well.
And then what were your like career interests in college, and then also how did you decide on like majoring in physics?
Um, I asked a lot of why questions at that age. I started college at the age of 17, and I think I just had this burning desire to understand, like how the universe was put together. Uh, um, and so, physics gave, an avenue for understanding some of the basic mysteries of the universe. And so that was just very interesting to me. So, I bounced back and forth between math and computer science and physics. I think it was formally a computer science major for like a semester before I went back to physics. But that seemed like a good major. At Harvard, you don't do double majors. So it was a good major for me to have a chance to explore my interests. And I was also, by the way, in the undergraduate teacher education program at Harvard. So you couldn't major in education, but I knew from pretty early on that I wanted to teach after college, at least for a while. And so I was also part of that program.
And was it just like a inside feeling that you wanted to teach, or I know you mentioned a lot of influential teachers throughout elementary through high school. Were they also part of your wanting to teach?
Yeah, I forgot to mention Mrs. Moore, who was my 7th and 8th grade math teacher, and she was also our math counts coach. She took us to DC when I qualified for the the math counts competition, the national math counts competition, and I remember being in this little tiny 8th grade geometry class. There were like 6 of us, and who knows why, but I decided the summer between 7th and 8th grade that what I really wanted to spend my summer doing was learning geometry. So I got my parents to buy me a geometry book, and I just kind of worked my way through it the summer before 8th grade. So when I got to 8th grade, like I knew most of the content, so I ended up teaching or co-teaching the class, with my teacher. And she looked at me one day and she says, "You are going to be a teacher one day." And I thought, oh no, I'm going to be a mathematician one day. Like, I'm not going to be a teacher. But I've always enjoyed, helping my classmates to understand math. And then I think the other influence that was really formative is when I was in high school, my dad signed me up for a math camp at Southwest Texas State University. It's called Texas State University. I think they changed names. But that math camp was really formative for me. There are a lot of elite math camps around the country for students who are, headed for the International Math Olympiad. But this camp was a little different. Max Warschauer, the director, made a choice, maybe in part because of funding, but I think also because of his philosophy, that he was going to bring together diverse students to this math camp. So, top math students from around the state of Texas, but from diverse parts of the state. So, a top student from a small high school in rural South Texas would be in the same math camp with students from top high schools in Houston, right? Private schools, top public schools. And when you mix this all together, there's very different levels of fluency in competition math and kind of more math that goes deeper than just what you're taught in school. And he always said that Max always said the best way to understand math is to teach it. And so he would put us into heterogeneous study groups every night, right? So every night you'd be for 4 hours, right, doing math with your friends. And, that really gave me a taste of teaching math to, diverse students from diverse backgrounds. And I think I fell in love with it. And so I think that experience, being first a student and then a counselor at the Southwest Texas Math Camp, really was a strong influence in my deciding to teach. It gave me confidence that this would be something that I could be good at and that I would enjoy.
Cool. And then, so after graduating from Harvard, what did you decide to do?
After graduating from Harvard, I was broke, remember? So, so I didn't finish the undergraduate teacher education program. That program I don't think exists anymore, but at the time, you needed to do a semester of student teaching so you could get your teaching license in Massachusetts. So that would be one more semester where I'd have to pay tuition, live somehow in Boston, and student teach, and I didn't have the money for that. So, so instead, I applied for and was accepted to Teach for America, which was only about 10 years old at the time. So it was still pretty early in that organization's history. And I went to teach in Texas's Rio Grande Valley.
Were you able to choose that location?
We were able to rank our preferences. And so I ranked Houston was a site, so that was my #1 choice. And then my second choice was the other site in Texas at the time, which is the RGV.
And what was that experience like during TFA?
Yeah, teaching in the Valley was an amazing experience. I was there for 4 years. The TFA commitment was 2 years, but I always felt that 2 years was too short of a time to really give back to a community that kind of opens their doors to you and invites a stranger in and says, like, come here and like teach our children, right? So I always knew that I wanted to stay a little bit longer than that. And I was fortunate to be at a great school that was very supportive. I had a chance to work with great students. And so I stayed there for 4 years, which is a measure of how much I enjoyed it. And, you know, I always feel about teaching, it's just such a privilege, right? Parents give you their children, right? And say, okay, we're going to trust you to like shape our kids' minds, right? And teaching in the Valley was really special too. I'd never lived in the Valley before. Actually, I'd never even visited before I, you know, picked up and moved there. And it's so different from Houston. You know, it's agricultural. I was teaching in the town Edcouch. At the time, Edcouch and Elsa were 2 little towns, combined population just over 10,000. It was the second poorest school district in Texas. The average education of parents was 3rd grade, and it was a, you know, it's a farming community. So you know, you drive through the fields to get to town, where you've got, you know, 1 stoplight and an HEB and, you know, a gas station, and then there's a school. There's a, you know, an amazing school, which is the center of community where families can come and get, you know, a quality education. It's kind of amazing. And it was a really, you know, warm community. The population in the Valley had transitioned prior to my arriving there in 2000. You know, if you go back 30 years, it was a pretty white area, but then slowly it shifted and became majority Mexican American. So when I was teaching at Edcouch Elsa, I think almost all of my students were Mexican American. You know, some recent immigrants, but many the children of immigrants. So many were the children of immigrants. So Mexican Americans who had been rooted in South Texas for a long time, many of whom were migrant workers. So you know, traveling north to harvest crops and coming back over the summer, and then coming back in the fall to go back home and to go to school. And it was just a really, I was so warmly welcomed. And for many of my students, you know, I was the first Chinese American they'd ever met. And it was just a great cultural exchange to learn about Mexican American culture in South Texas, and for my students to have a chance to learn from me too.
What grade and subject did you teach?
I taught high school. Mostly I taught physics, so juniors and seniors.
And what do you like going into physics education? What did you imagine like your challenges would be? And then what were the actual challenges you faced while teaching?
I don't know what I imagined the challenges would be. I think first year teachers are always um, worried about classroom management or discipline, right? I was 21 when I started teaching, and some of my students were not much younger, 19. So, so certainly when I looked like a student, I worried about classroom management. I shouldn't have been so worried. My students were great. And I think what I was surprised by was how much my students struggled with the math, right? So in trying to teach physics, you assume at the high school level, you assume that students understand algebra, right? And if they don't, then they're kind of struggling with the language that you use to communicate and to explore physics. And so that was a challenge. And what else? When I first went to teach at Edcouch, physics was a pretty elite class. So time had been when only one or two classes out of the graduating class, so maybe 50 students out of a graduating class of 200 or 300 would ever take physics. But we slowly transitioned physics to be kind of your basic class, right? So most students in the high school would default to biology, chemistry, physics. And not every student would take physics, but the idea that most would as juniors was new, right? So in expanding that program, we had to order a lot of equipment. So when I first got there, I remember I had a class set of textbooks, I had a box of chalk, and I had a meter stick, which is not a lot of equipment to go about teaching physics. So, I, spent a lot of time at the hardware store, buying, random equipment in order to build good physics experiments. It's actually a great place to buy equipment. And then ordering a lot of equipment to build up that program.
So was that program, I guess, already like in the works of being established, or did you have to like work to get it, like established and then convince other people to like help you out?
It was. So there was actually a TFA teacher who was already teaching physics at the school. Her name was Sarah Bezick. And so she was there a couple years before me, and she had already started that process. So I was there as a second physics teacher to further expand that program. And then when she left for medical school, I stayed and continued to help build that program.
And so you were there for 4 years. What were your plans after, you ended teaching for Teach for America?
Initially, when I went into Teach for America, I thought I would go back and apply for graduate school. But I just fell in love with teaching. I just really enjoyed every day, being out there with my students, helping instill in them that love of learning and of exploration that my parents and my teachers had given me. I had the chance to send some students to study at Stanford and at MIT, and so I enjoyed so much working with students and working with people to make a change in kind of social outcomes and educational outcomes for kids, that I couldn't see myself going back into physics and doing research, like being back in a basement, configuring lasers. So so that left me with the challenge of deciding what then specifically to do, right? I After 4 years of teaching, I was doing some training for physics teachers. So I thought about doing graduate school in physics education. Um, so I explored a number of different areas, but I decided, okay, I'm going to start to explore options besides physics graduate school.
Oh, okay. And then, so did you end up, so you did end up getting like a master's degree, I think they
I
called that.
did. I ended up going back to Harvard, to the Harvard Kennedy School, where I studied public policy.
And how was that?
And that came about in large part because I saw how public policies did affect my students. You know, I saw I was teaching, you know, when 9/11 happened, and when my students began to be drafted into the Iraq War, and I, you know, saw how um, immigration policy and clinics, health clinics, you know, all of these public policy pieces affected very directly the lives of my students and the opportunities that they and their families would have. And so I thought, you know, I want to learn more about where these things come from. And studying public policy was a great chance to do that.
Okay, cool. And then I guess, how was your time like at Harvard studying public policy? Were you able to like get like, I guess, get your feet wet in making policies and like writing up, you know, policy drafts and stuff?
Yeah, the public policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School um, is incredibly useful training. It's very practical. So it's a great mix of studying theory, but then also looking at how do you take research um, and data and process it, not just for research sakes, not just to write some more papers, and you can do that, but also to immediately turn it into actionable plans, right? When you have to make decisions very quickly on the ground as a policymaker. So it was great training, and we had a chance in every class to do projects, and sometimes to do you know, to do things that would actually go out and be used. There's partnerships between the city of Somerville, the city of Boston, with Harvard University. So it's just really wonderful training.
And then what brought you back to Houston after public policy school?
Yeah, well, my family's in Houston. My parents, and my grandmother as well, my mom's mom, who immigrated to Houston after Hong Kong went back to China. So my grandmother wasn't in Houston when I was growing up, but then came back to Houston while I was in college. And so I wanted to be back home, spend more time with my family, have the opportunity to spend more time with my grandmother as well. So Houston is what made sense for me.
Oh, did she move after 1997 or before the handover?
It was about the same time. Yeah, so I guess that's when I was in college. Yeah, in 97, she came to Houston.
And then moving on to, like, I guess, your campaign experience running for the HISD Board of Education. Can you describe that process and if, I guess, your identity had impacted your campaign in any way?
Yeah. So my decision to run for HISD School Board was influenced very much by my experience as a teacher in Houston. When I came to Houston, I worked at Lee High School, which is the same high school I was zoned to growing up. It serves the west side of Houston. It serves a lot of immigrant communities, so students from all over the world, from sub-Saharan Africa, from Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America. And And I really felt like working at Lee High School that, you know, the work that we were doing was almost holy. I come from a family of immigrants, and previously even refugees, right? If you go back in my family history, my father's father fled from China to Hong Kong in the early 50s with my dad and his sister, and so, to serve refugee and immigrant families here in Houston and to give them a chance to, after whatever they've experienced, right, come to America, get a good education, and then have a chance to, to fulfill your dream, right, for you and for your family. Like, that's what every immigrant wants. And I just felt having a chance to do that work was just a real privilege, right? And really, I thought for a while that I might do teaching and then public policy advocacy from Lee High School without looking for any other job. But what I started to see is how policies at the national level, at the state level, and then cascading down to the district level impacted my students, and sometimes in really negative ways. So there was a Harvard professor, Roland Fryer, who came to Houston and began to consult with Houston ISD schools while I was teaching there to, the idea was to improve HISD schools. And there were some good things about the program. It's called Apollo. It brought additional funding, additional resources to schools, tutoring for students. But it also took a really kind of mechanistic approach, maybe not surprising coming from an economist, to school improvement. A lot of looking at students as numbers, looking at the data, and then in a very mechanistic way, saying, all right, you're a manager, right? You're a principal, you're a teacher, make the numbers go up. And as somebody who used to work, still worked, right, 80, 100-hour weeks, right, trying to do whatever I could to help my students improve, and who had amazing results too with students. I had helped raise the TAKS passing rate. TAKS is a standardized test in Texas at the time. The science pass rate, which is required for high school graduation, went up almost 30 points my first year teaching there, right? Because of efforts I made as a teacher and as a team player in the school, working with other science teachers to really raise science achievement in the school in a really right? Like, we took the approach of having Super Science Saturdays and having kids come in and have fun, right? Learning science. And you really understand it, then you automatically do better on your tests. But I saw this really mechanistic approach to education come in, and suddenly our kids who, like, my fellow teachers and I, we always felt like these kids are us, right? Like we went to public schools. We had every chance in our life because we had teachers who cared about us, and we had a chance to get a good education, right? And now we have a chance to serve kids who, like us, are immigrants or refugees, who are trying to make it. But we understand where they're coming from. Like, we understand, maybe if you lived half your life in a refugee camp in Jordan because your family was affected by the Iraq War, then you're going to have trouble reading the science tests, right? When you get a science question that asks, okay, which of these traits is adaptive, and the correct answer is claw, well, you might understand what an adaptation is. You might, have passed your high school English class, but you might not have studied the word claw in your high school biology class because you just didn't grow up here, right? And what I saw was this kind of no excuses approach that was really hard on students, that really made them feel down on themselves. And in the end, started doing things that I thought were, unethical and probably illegal, right? I saw kids being encouraged to drop out of school because, okay, well, you're going to graduate in 5 years. That's not going to look good on our record, right? I think 5 years, graduating in 5 years when you've come to this country as a new immigrant, as a refugee, is amazing. It's a success story. but it makes a high school that wants to show a high 4-year graduation rate look bad, right? So we had kids who were actively counseled out of school, like kids on the street, right? You find them on the street and you're like, where are you, right? I thought you had moved back to Mexico. I thought you went to Florida, right? That's what the form you signed said. No, miss, I'm still here, right? Like that kind of stuff was happening because the adults wanted to make the numbers look good, right? For the economists at Harvard, which had nothing to do with making the lives of children better. And you know, and really good I saw amazing teachers who had transformed kids' lives, right? Who were fighting to have kids taken care of, right? Whistleblowers, I guess, who were being pushed out of the profession, right? Basically given trash records so they could never work again as teachers. And so, you know, I started to talk with people from around the city, from around the country, and realized it wasn't just Lee High School, right? You might just think, oh, this is just a nightmare scenario because of like one rogue economist and like one superintendent, you know, one nasty principal. But then you start to realize that similar stories are playing out across the city, across the country even, and then you realize, oh, okay, this is being driven by public policies. This is being driven by, you know, people who don't understand education. I think you can just apply some metrics and then set some expectations, and then magically get results without understanding how to actually improve education as an art, as a system. So I started organizing. So I found some fellow teachers who had been organizers in the past. And, you know, I had taken a class in community organizing at Harvard, at the Kennedy School. And I said, okay, well, what we need is an organization of parents and students and teachers working together to articulate what a more positive path forward is for education. So I started an organization called Community Voices for Public Education. And we started going to meet with school board members. We started talking to the newspapers. We started telling the stories of our students and asking for a change. We got the HISD school board to pass a resolution that was ultimately passed by school boards across the state of Texas, saying high stakes testing had gone too far. It led to a reduction in high stakes testing at the state level within a couple of years. And then, you know, we started to see some improvements at the state level, but still not improvements at the local level, which led to us saying, okay, well, we need better local leaders, right? So we looked it up and said, oh, well, you know, the school board are the ones who hire the superintendent, set the policy, set the vision for the school district. We need to support some better school board candidates. And then come to find out when we start working for campaigns, et cetera, actually what we needed were some better candidates. And so I got strong-armed by one of my colleagues into running for school board. To the question of identity, I would say identity affected my campaign in a couple of ways. You know, one is just that sense of, you know, I am my students are me. You know, that same ethic, that same ethos, belief that I brought to my teaching, I brought to my campaign as well. You know, we can't treat the children of Houston like they are the other. Like, it's okay to give them a substandard education, while, you know, an education in a private school in Houston looks very different. Like, that's not okay. That's not going to be okay for our future. And so that's one way where my identity, I think, just informed the approach I took to my work in education, whether a teacher, organizer, or a candidate. And then the other way, you know, the other experience I had as a candidate, I was the first, I think, very competitive candidate in Houston for Houston School Board who was Asian. And so, you know, a lot of people kind of looked at me and said, well, who are you, right? We don't know who you are. Even leaders within the Asian communities, well, we don't know you. So what makes you think you can run a campaign and win? Um, so so that was a surprising experience to me, in campaigning. But I think also, um, being the first really competitive Asian American to run for school board, and then the first Asian American to eventually win, I think also, um, inspired a lot of people. So I hear from students sometimes, that they are inspired by my story. I hear from parents, too, and people who've supported my campaign, that it's meaningful to look at the school board and to see somebody that looks like them. And so there's a way in which, that I'm proud to be a trailblazer in that way, and to hear from people around the district, that, oh, you're a role model for us. That's very meaningful.
A follow-up question I had was, how would you encourage, I guess, like, besides like being the trailblazer and like showing that there is representation in like education, how would you encourage, I guess, like other Asian Americans to be involved in politics, or like, yeah.
Uh, so is the question, what message do I have for Asian Americans? Like, or how would I personally want to encourage them? Like, what exactly are you asking?
I guess like, because I feel like there's like Asian Americans in general have a lower like voter turnout, so like less involved politically. I guess, how would you encourage Asian Americans to be more involved politically?
Yeah. Um, yeah. It's true that Asian Americans participate in the political process much less than other groups. We vote at far lower rates. We run for office at lower rates. And I think it's to our detriment, because it means that we're not represented in decision making. And it means that our communities, um, who are incredibly diverse, don't get the resources and support that they need. I think that is one reason why it's hard for Asian Americans to run, is because Asia is such a diverse group. And so when you say Asian Americans, well, that's a political construct, right? We have immigrants from countries all over Asia who come to the US, who don't know each other, whose countries might be in conflict back home, right? And so to come together as a collective Asian American group is something that you have to learn. So as a member of OCA, Greater Houston, where I've been on the board for, gosh, it's been at least 5 years now. I've really learned the importance of that kind of work. The one thing I've learned as a board member of OCA Greater Houston is how incredibly diverse the Asian American community is in Houston. And I've also learned about how Asian Americans have been subject to racial discrimination in the US, whether overt, like we're starting to see unfortunately today with the COVID-19 epidemic, or like Vincent Chen, the auto worker incident in Detroit, Michigan, back in the late 70s, early 80s, or whether it's structural racism, right? So we see both, and I've learned about that by becoming more involved in the Asian American community through OCA Greater Houston, and one thing that I'm proud to have advocated for as a school board member and as a member of OCA Greater Houston is for data disaggregation, for us to look at how subgroups within the Asian community are affected. You see, for instance, in education that Asian students as a whole outperform other groups in the US, but then you see subgroups within those, more recent refugees who need a lot of additional support, but who get missed when you don't disaggregate data in that way. So I would say to Asian Americans, if you want to make sure that, you know, that America, which is the country where you live, right, is the country where you have future dreams for yourself and for your family. If you want to make sure that it's the country or it's the state or it's the city that you want to live in, um, then you need to be part of the process to make it a more fair, a more just society. And if you're not part of the process, if your group is excluded from politics, then that means that people who need support from government, who need to have equality, to have an equal playing field, are not going to get that. So advocacy is really important. It's important to read up and pay attention to issues. It's important to communicate with politicians, with elected officials, because if you're not seen and you're not heard as a voter and as an advocate, then you're going to get forgotten.
And then I guess reflecting back on how you were first a teacher and then you became more active like on the public policy side, do you miss being a teacher, or like what's that, I guess, comparison between working?
Oh, that's a great question. I miss being a teacher every day. When you're a teacher, you have an opportunity to make a deep, profound impact on your class, right? Whether you're an elementary teacher with 24 kids, or whether you're a high school teacher with like 6 classes of 30 kids. Either way, like, you have a chance to go deep and really make a difference in kids' lives. I still hear from kids that I taught, almost 20 years ago, which is really neat. And as a trustee, you have a chance to impact more students, right? There's over 200,000 students that are my responsibility in Houston ISD. And I have a chance through policy to build programs that have a big impact. For instance, something I worked on my first year as a trustee is building wraparound supports for our students. HISD is 80% low income. Our students come to school or don't even make it to school sometimes because of challenges they have at home. And if we can help students take care of some of those non-academic needs, then it's easier for them to do well at school. Same concept of financial aid at the college level, right? So we built policy that year that's paying off now that we've got this COVID-19 crisis that paid off during the Hurricane Harvey that hit a couple of years back, where a majority of our schools now have wraparound specialists who are connected with resources and agencies around the city. So when a student comes to school and says, look, I just lost, we just got kicked out of the house, right? I slept in a car last night. Or he's like, miss, like, I haven't washed my clothes, right? in like a week, right? And I'm ashamed to be at school, right? We can take care, or I can't see the board, right? Because I haven't had a checkup, right? Or my glasses broke, right? Like, we can solve those problems so that students can come to school and focus on school while they're there. So that's a piece of policy work that I did, my first year on the board, recognizing where kids are coming to us with, helping meet students where they are, so that then you can set those high standards and help them reach those high standards. So now my Twitter feed is full of these amazing stories, right, of wraparound specialists who are there with families, making a difference in their lives so that kids can continue to learn. But I miss sometimes, being that person to work directly with students and families too.
So what are, I guess, like today, what is the greatest obstacles that you see in education and like the work you do?
Texas always ranks, it depends how you measure it, but Texas always ranks towards the bottom in terms of investment in education. And resources matter. We see that across the world, we see that across states, we see that inside of Texas, where school districts that have more resources outperform school districts that don't have them. And we feel that now, for instance, with everybody homebound from COVID-19, if you can get a hotspot and a tablet or a laptop into a child's hands, right, their experience at home is going to be radically different from a kid who you send home with a stack of paper and say, okay, here's a stack of paper, please work through it on your own, right? And just, you know, learn. um, so resources matter in education. That's always been something that's important. I would say the second big challenge that we need to confront, maybe even more important than the first, is we need to honor teachers, we need to train teachers, we need to raise up teaching as a profession. You know, in Asia, teachers, in East Asia, teachers are not only highly respected, but they're also well trained and supported. So in some of the countries where we see students performing really well, outperforming the US, Japan, Shanghai, you see that investment in teachers as a profession. And in the US, we don't do the same. Teachers are not drawn from, you know, the top students in universities. You know, you look at Harvard University, it didn't have a, you know, education as a major. It didn't have a really clear, viable path for students to become teachers because it wasn't seen as a priority for students at the, you know, the top Ivy League school in the country. That's changed at Harvard. So I think there's some good work being done to look at how you can encourage really top students to go into education, not just for a couple of years. Teach for America is a great program, but you cannot radically transform, you know, teaching by just making it something that people do for a couple of years and move on. Like, to really elevate the profession and to therefore really transform the quality of education that students get, I think we as a country need to completely rethink how we recruit, how we train, how we professionally develop teachers.
And then I guess moving on to like your family and then like being in Houston. So how did you meet your husband?
My husband and I met online at Match.com. It was the best $25 I ever spent.
And with your parents being, I guess, like from Hong Kong, did you have any cultural traditions that you had like growing up that you also are wanting to pass on to your daughter?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that my parents raised me with a sense of pride in, you know, in being Chinese, in knowing kind of some of the cultural history of China. And, you know, there are a few cultural traditions that we observe, like, you know, the Mid-Autumn Festival, and, you know, celebrating the Lunar New Year, and, you know, my daughter knows how to ask for red pockets. But I don't think that, you know, I think that we haven't passed on in my family very strong Chinese traditions. One thing I do take from kind of my broader Chinese heritage is that I'm Buddhist, and so my daughter has grown up, you know, talking to Buddhas, and, you know, and so that's a piece of cultural heritage that I look to pass on.
And then how would you, since you grew up in Houston, went to public schools in Houston, and then came back to teach, and are living in Houston, raising your daughter, how would you say that Houston has changed over time?
Houston's changed a lot. I'm always amazed when I come back to Chinatown after being away, how much it seems to have grown, right? Asiatown in Houston has just expanded tremendously. When my parents first came here, there were a few blocks downtown and there wasn't anything on Bellaire Boulevard, but now it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So, you know, the quality of Chinese grocery sure has improved over the years. I feel like when I go back to Hong Kong now, You know, my relatives say, oh, you can eat this, you can eat that. I say, I have to disappoint you, right? We can eat all of that in Houston too. What else about Houston has changed? You know, Houston is increasingly diverse. You know, when I was younger growing up, I think, you know, my classmates were, you know, white and Hispanic and Black, and there were, you know, Chinese immigrants like myself, like my family. But now, you know, there's more Indian immigrants. My husband's Indian. There are, you know, students from many more countries that are here in Houston. You know, Asians are one of the fastest growing groups here in Houston. What else has changed? We've got more green space in Houston. Like, it's a delight, you know, after coming back from college, to go downtown and to see the revitalization there. I hope that lasts through this current epidemic. To see the walk and the biking trails, you know. So I think there's a lot of ways in which Houston has become more attractive, you know, more of a fun place to live, great food. And those are some of the changes I've seen over the years.
Okay, awesome. And then you mentioned COVID-19 before,
Yeah.
but how has that impacted your life, and then also your job, like on the board?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, like many folks who are able to do so, I'm home now. So I've been home mostly for the last 3 to 4 weeks, except for trips grocery shopping. And so that means my husband and I are both working from home. We're taking care of our daughter who's from home, whose school was closed indefinitely, just like all of Houston ISD schools. It's a change of pace. It reminds me very much of my first year, of my daughter's first year. You know, being home with her all the time without a lot of support in terms of childcare. So, you know, so there's sweet things about it. I enjoy being home with my family. My husband usually travels, so it's nice having him home. But it's also tough, right? Not having that network of support. And we very much miss, you know, our my parents who live in town. You know, not being able to visit them regularly is tough. In terms of working, you know, the work for HLIC School Board doesn't stop, you know, so we are remote now. We had an online board meeting yesterday, so from 2 until 9, right? We just did it on Zoom instead of in person. I still have community meetings. I just have them in Zoom instead of in person. And, you know, I would say this disaster, like Hurricane Harvey previously in Houston, it really makes me worry for our kids. And so I think that's the biggest change is, you know, in a sense of disaster, when there's a disaster, right, you want to get out there and do everything you can to help make a difference for those who you know are most vulnerable. And, you know, right now, that's all of our families right now in Houston ISD are suffering, right? People are losing jobs, even people who thought their jobs were secure. For the majority of our families, you know, they're living hand to mouth, right? It's kind of day to day. They don't have a lot of savings. And so this virus, which has stopped our economy and you know, makes it a choice between, you know, risking their lives and staying home, but not having the resources to, you know, feed themselves is really hard. We have a lot of undocumented students in Houston, so even though, you know, the government's trying to step up and help families, some of those aren't going to reach a lot of our communities in Houston. So I'm very worried. You know, you would think that a school board member would mostly be focused on education, right? So, okay, let's get kids, you know, educational packets, or let's get them devices. But we always in Houston have had to worry about feeding our kids, because if kids are hungry, they're not going to be able to show up to school and learn. And now it's even more so, right? How do we get food out to kids? How do we get them the them and their families the supports they need so they can be safe first, because unless you have safety, then you can't sit down and try to learn math or reading. So all of those things weigh really heavily on me. I'm blessed to have a lot of connections and networks from having lived in Houston for so long and having done so much advocacy work. And so I'm able to make some connections, but there is this part of me that just feels impatient and feels just unsatisfied, right, by the dichotomy between my immediate existence, where I'm living in a house with an adequately, filled pantry, with electricity, with Wi-Fi, and then my ability to turn around and help families who I know don't have those things. And knowing that because of the virus, you can't just get out there and help people much more directly. It's really hard right now.
And you also mentioned discrimination and racism against Asians, Asian Americans due to COVID-19. How should like this be addressed in your opinion?
In Houston, we've been fortunate that a lot of leaders have stepped up to denounce that kind of racism. Our mayor has invited in and honored Asian leaders who have been making donations of masks, of PPE to the Houston community. Representative State Rep Jean Wu, who's my state rep, has been doing an amazing job. Like, he's rounded up a lot of donations from the Asian community of PPE, and he's out there delivering it to all corners of Houston, to all communities every single day. I think that the Asian community in the US, we're blessed because we have a lot of connections back in Asia. And so we're able to get shipments of PPE over to the US, or we have them stockpiled because, we're always worried about the next pandemic. So we've got those things ready to go. And I think sharing them with the wider American community, has been a positive step and a positive approach that people have taken. And I'm just really gratified to see some leaders in the US who are not Asian Americans stepping up and acknowledging those efforts and really saying, look, we're all in this together, and splitting us into different groups and blaming one group or the other isn't how we come together as Americans and beat this. I think Asian Americans actually have a really important role in leading efforts to combat the epidemic here in the US. And I hope that we can, as a society, come to see more those efforts and see more about the benefits that Asian Americans bring to the whole country, than to fall into the trap of blaming people, which doesn't actually yield improved outcomes for anyone.
Okay. And then kind of a concluding question is, what would you say are your greatest accomplishments so far?
Oh, that's a big question. I'm very proud to have led a lot of policy work on the Houston ISD School Board. So working to make sure that we have wraparound services and supports for our students is one important piece. We need to understand our students and where they come from and the barriers to their success, and get those barriers out of the way. And then the second piece, I think, of helping students succeed in education is to set really high expectations, to really acknowledge the great potential that every single student has, no matter their background, to be that next scientist to find the vaccine for COVID, or to be a mayor or a county judge, right? Or to be a lawyer and an advocate. our students are our future. And if we segregate students and expect great things from some but not from others, then we're not going to have a very bright future. And so I'm proud as a school board member to have, in addition to setting some policy around wraparound support, so also written policy around expectations for college and career readiness, to make sure that we're monitoring and reporting on the performance of subpopulations of students, looking at how our students who are English learners, our students with disabilities, economically disadvantaged students, to make sure that we're looking at how all of them are doing and being prepared for college and career. Are we offering them AP classes? Are we offering them IB classes, CTE courses? Those are some of the policy pieces that I've worked on. And I'm proud to say that Houston ISD was rated by the state of Texas to have a B+ overall, and to have an A for college and career readiness this past academic year.
Okay, awesome. And so we're nearing the end of the interview. Are there any like last remarks you wanted to make, or words of advice you wanted to end the interview with?
Not in particular, no. I really enjoyed the interview. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Ms. Song, for allowing the archives to interview you.